Video 116, the ancient live stream of Mark Wade Sheldon of Arizona. Greetings and hello. This here is the ancient spirit Tralaka, here flowing in spirit through the vocal cords of groovyev. This evening, we are going down the ancient live stream of Mark Wade Sheldon, of that sunshine state of Arizona. It is a very fitting place for Mark being there because Arizona has so many mystical areas which have yet to be realized by many. Portals, time slips, gateways, hidden bases underneath, and visitations from otherworldly beings of some which have good intentions for who they visit, while others come to that state with more devious, sinister plots against any humanoids. For I tell you clearly that there is no real secret of those conniving, chafing irritations between those off-world beings who live under the surface in miles and miles long caverns, that of other states hidden caverns under the surface of the planet's surface here of Earth, of off-world beings such as those in the New Mexico area state who live under many caverns under the state of Nevada also, as well as the lower Midwest state of Illinois. Those chafing conflicts have gone on, some for hundreds of thousands and longer of years. Yet for Arizona, there is many safe areas that is truly mystical in nature, which have never been disturbed by modern humans yet, or adjusted by the cranky ones in those caverns deep below. Those mystical areas, every person should go and enjoy, to learn from, to grow from, to enjoy this incredible feelings, and then as they leave, to leave it as mystical as when they had come to it, so they can be enjoyed for many generations yet to come. Though for us now let us go down that actual ancient live stream of Mark Wade Sheldon, for this live stream stretches far into the past as we look going to the Vega systems of planets and moons. Mark was an old tall gray, very interesting here, was of 4,026 solar years long of that life, not real long for that of old tall grays, though there is different variations of old tall grays, which have been spoken of before. But let us clear up some more information here, for some of which are millions and millions of years, solar years that is, old, though they normally were not commonly seen by others. Then there is the old tall grays. This is what the term warmongers, the ancient tall grays, who the ancient spirit Tralaka loved to call. For that particular species of old tall gray were well known for their warmongering, even though they connive continually to create wars between species in which they take their spoils of riches and other uses, while they don't usually personally get involved. What a bunch of jerks. But it was here that the slicing of old grays created many offshoots of tall grays, hybrided into many, many different variations, for some which would later leave as groups from their so-called old home areas, of the living local universe where they were to find peaceful other areas to live or to nest and so forth, because they had this double flex helix DNA coil of those old tall grays, which have so much depth of that DNA to be able to create from other species to join together, which would be a combining of a very stable DNA in the new creation. This held very true when the tall old grays were they by other species hybrided into different variations, of which sometimes were to create warriors to fight against the ancient tall grays, against others for other wars. Interesting little situation there, creating warriors from old gray stock DNA to fight against old tall grays. And they say in the universe there's no humor. Here I pen to differ. For Mark, in his first life in the Vega system of planets, was 4,026 solar years long, standing at 9 feet 9 inches tall. Though being of some heritage of the old tall grays, he was a pale gray in color. His larger eyes than normal, even for a gray, had some very unusual character to it, being that normally they were a deep ocean blue in color. This is very strange. Though when he would be in, let's say, a conflict with another being, his eyes would turn to a coal black, which would also give him great seeing even in the depths of the night, which was rather unnerving for those who did not know him personally. Now, the records show that Mark in that life working in the legal department as well as other lives, though this is not what is actually being seen in this actual viewing, though, however. Very, very interesting. Though Mark spent much of his life dealing in the legal system in the council courtrooms, his memory was so incredible that could challenge that of a computer that we would know now here on Earth. He never showed up in those courts with stacks of papers and files. He would show up in a 4-part tuxedo, including top hat and walking stick. No one really knew that within that very detailed, sculptured walking stick was a laser rifle with enough of a charge for nearly a full hour battle against someone else in a gun battle. It was, though, at his home. He would not be seen studying law, but studying theater plays of other worlds, which also included transmissions of live theater shows, which he obtained from his friends, some of which who traveled between other local planetary systems. Mark always felt in that life that he should have more personality. He felt that strain on his gray heritage that was so of lack, that he really marveled of some of the other species who would either live on that planet where he was or was visiting. So in his spare time, he could be seen rehearsing to better enhance his character from watching the plays of the characters being portrayed. Now, this here, though, this would fit him like a tight pair of gloves in his early career in the council courtrooms, and later as he doubled as a spy and a comedian. Wow, what a version of an old gray as a comedian. Wow. Mark would travel to other planets even in the Vega systems of planets and moons, earning him large amounts of credit. For please, please understand, in those ancient times, in those locations, for a version of an old tall gray to be a comedian would be like a cow in the state of Wisconsin going and speaking in comedy clubs as the main header comedian for years of speaking engagements booked ahead. So this was not a normal thing, even in Wisconsin. For Mark, though he could bring the house down with his comedy acts and standing ovations over and over of his humor while having every single motion of the suspects in the crowds or as he was walking around the cities or villages and then referencing with his already information he had, it was pure awe-inspiring on how he could recall such intricate details that even professional law enforcement and surveillance and spies couldn't even come close to reaching that benchmark that he had in that particular life. Though it was a lonely night, that very dark night, Mark would meet MAGIX, a Pleiadian female humanoid, who hadn't seen him coming around a corner of a walkway and plow right into him, spilling over all the last shows she had been to of Mark's fifth dimensional hollow posters all over the walkway. Mark stepped back as MAGIX was now kneeling to pick up those 5D holo posters. Well now there, young lassie. Running on the wild side a bit now, aren't you? Now, that would spend the remainder of Mark's life. From that moment, she was so in love with him, even with his outer character being of an old tall gray. This here, with that little comment he made, created a bonding, a gluing of fabric of space together, you could say, of these two. For later, they would travel long and far in those systems of planets and moons, and later build a high-powered studio for radio shows, which, though under a purple dome, had an inspiring view of their home planet below. The next 3 lives, Mark was that of a gray hybrid, averaging only 6 feet in height, not unusual, in the Vega planetary systems of planets and moons. All 3 lives as a team-building 4-man. The third one, Mark as a gray hybrid at 6 foot tall, his eyes, which had this added feature of double closing eyelids. He was known for wearing this long head of hair, but was not his own. So he was a gray hybrid and he had this long head of hair. Not known of grays to even have something like that normally back in those eras. But this was from killing a u.f.o beast who had attacked an early location Mark and his crew had begun to prepare for construction. This beast had 4 legs and a set of upper arms, which could run on all 6 if necessary, or on the lower 4, while clutching its prey or fighting with the upper forearms. This beast, this incredible beast, which had the average of a 20-mile in range, which he would prowl, or those of that species of beast would prowl as their turf, though carrying both sex plumbings within, would never mate, but from a young age would leave the cave or from the nesting in the natural surroundings to find the own prowling territories. As adults, their full body hair was normally 4 inches long, in the mid-brown to black in color. The center rich, going down the back of the spine, from the top of the head all the way down the spine, was much thicker and longer hair, averaging nearly 8 to 10 inches on that long strip, which was almost a foot wide, which the species who lived in the villages or cities, the spirit beings, whether humanoids or otherwise, they could use to tell the age of the beast by the color of that long hair that went down the spinal column. For as they aged, the color went from deep black to brown, even to blondish, should one of those beasts ever live that long, which at that age would have grown to having a nearly 70-mile range of preying territory, and the most fierce of all those beasts. It was on one of those early job sites that would put Mark on the first arriving crew into the crosshairs of one of those older beasts. The twin suns were setting in the distance, shadows casting over the job site. The lights had not yet been turned, being still in a time of construction. For the rest of the crews, they've been there only 3 solar days. As Mark and his 6-foot-tall, mid-gray body moved across from his own shuttle, across the wildlands to the construction site, he felt his body go into this defensive manner he hadn't known he had before. Though he had practiced in many protection arts, but this here was different. It felt like every nerve in his body was bristling with this bountiful energy for defense. Then he heard this loud crash and a blood-throttling scream far in the distance. Mark began to run at full speed, and as that gray species, he could run very, very fast, while reaching over his back to a slip opening in the back folds of his outer uniform jacket for a long curved blade, 16 inches long from the handle to the tip. As he ran, he remembered those deep scars across the front of both of his legs from not being prepared in his very first job in his career when he was yet a student. It had also been the first time in his life he swore over and over, cursing into the air, threatening, even as that of a humanoids around him had learned a few words that day. It had felt good, though he pondered if this was healthy for him to be being more human. Though today, it was his own crew in harm. This was personal. Another humanoid flaw he had taken for himself. As Mark ran, more centered now, quickly down to the new construction site, still in the building, he saw parts of his work crew strewn around the ground, some in pieces. He ran on, the long curved blade positioned on his right hand in a defensive manner. He jumped quickly but silently up to a lower edge of the rocks, up to near one of the buildings. And on that edge, he crouched in the new shadows, listening to that below him. He could not aid those already dying, who had been ripped apart, some of them out of blood already. He was gambling on saving those still alive that really looked up to him as being their leader. And he had learned from variations of humanoid he grew up with. Where would the end, he wondered, and he pondered in those dark moments, would this human interference keep getting into his life? But now he could feel, even on that large rock he was on here, it was vibrating. And from something he felt that was on the grounds below, which was very heavy to move this big rock and vibrations. It had to be heavy, he thought, but was running fast because of the way the vibrations were feeling in a rock. Mark jumped in a power dive into that black shadow, moving, driving his long curved blade into something he could not yet see. The 100 decibel deep toned screaming of this beast popped both of his eardrums at that time, causing a rather confusing moments for Mark for a bit as his other arm reached behind him for that other long curved 16-inch blade. In one fluid motion, it was swiftly pulled out from its pocket back there, and his left hand swirling it around into the defense move that was also into the back of this unseen beast, so holding dearly onto the handles as this beast was screaming and making these vicious maneuvers to try to shake Mark loose. Mark pulled for what seemed a lifetime on bringing both of those blades together, cutting their way through what's down there. Though this didn't happen, though there was deep inside this beast was so thrashing around, Mark held on like Velcro twins interwoven together. The beast had given up on staying at that new construction site and ran at nearly 40 miles an hour. Wow! Speeds through the trails and through the rocky, wooded areas, trying to maneuver in ways to strip this creature off the back of him, with this creature being Mark. Now, Mark, that even being a gray hybrid, he had his limitations. He had begun to tire. The beast was nothing like anything he had ever gone up against or heard about. Yet he knew if he tired first, that beast would go back for the rest of the crew, which theoretically he thought were still living. Now, that beast had slowed now and went back to trying to pull Mark off his back. That rugged surroundings, the beast trying to use those surroundings for his advantage. Well, at least what was thought of the beast. So Mark saw this little overhanging of rocks, the long protruding rocks coming towards him as the beast was going toward him in a swift, fluid motion that surprised even Mark as he pulled his two curved blades up out of the back of this beast and flipped his body over the protruding rocks and forcibly into the path of his beast that he jumped off of, driving both curved blades into what seemed to where the throat would probably be, and pulling them together. The beast growled, fiercely shaking and thrashing around, and nearly 100 decimal screaming again. Wow! As it dropped to the ground, rolling over to its side, back and forth, as the beast's forearms tried to clutch Mark between its closing long claws. Not quite, but the beast died. It was later that day, before the remaining crew that Mark had left behind there had located him. And this was mostly because Mark had worked on reconstructing his communicator, which had been in his back of his jacket, but really didn't survive very well that thrashing around with that beast on that wild journey. But using the twin sun's rays to recharge the battery, he sorted out different parts, working parts, non-working parts, to construct a basic homing beacon instead. On the head of Mark now was a long blondish hair, which went down into his lower back, all cleaned up and looking as it belonged there. How strange! Though the crew members as they remembered him just from the other day and from other job sites. He didn't have no hair. Though as they came over to him, Mark had already treated the hair and his hide and fitted everything into parts to his head, and so it looked really normal. A gray hybrid with a fitted long, really thick blonde hair. Now this would be the story of a battle to last the ages. But it was also that battle, which would drive that career of Mark for the reputation for protecting his crews regardless of what challenged them. That long, thick blonde hair would stay on him throughout his entire career. In fact, even through the rest of his living years of that life. Striving to stay with the crews he did on locations whenever he could. He was an inspiration for both humanoids as well as the gray hybrids, for they understood from what they understood that this person, this being, this Mark of gray hybrid, of such determination, perseverance, never say no, get the job done. They would actually see fifth dimensional hollow statue artwork of Mark on different college campuses on the local planets, wearing that long beast blonde hair, proudly posing with those two long curved 16-inch blades in front of him in a curving crossed motion. Mark's career, this interesting, unique career, put him in this rather nasty environment over and over, which is why he made the big credits. And his crews also building and connecting what is called glass eel tubes that transport shuttles or even hover trains or newer concepts of what we'll call transportation across safely the surface of planets between the cities or orbiting moons and such. This glass eel was a whole new idea and was still gaining popularity because of side effects when forming a glass eel, which could end up having very violent explosions during its solidification. Though when solidified, it was perfectly safe and it was a perfect containment for a transport to go shooting down through that tube. Though it was crystal clear, it was as durable as solid cast steel variations of lines for so many generations were used on different planets, subterranean tunnels and moons. But that third life was cut short for Mark at 1,713 solar years old. From a science lab on a recent job site he was at, it exploded. The powerful pulsing waves of that explosion were so violent in its linear projection outwards from that site, it ripped through that site's part-time office / home of Mark as he was conducting a four-dimensional hollow video meeting with a college professor. Now, in the next two lives, Mark would be back in the Vega planetary systems, though as a non-humanoid at 7 foot 1 inches tall. What is known about those lives was that he was a pilot, a cross between a variation of lizardy and reptilian variation. Interesting way of being, because he had characteristics of lizard beings and also reptilian beings. Many times in different parts of the living universe, those particular variations generally don't get along. However, here Mark was in this life His body was, it looked part lizardly and part reptilian. Not much one for talk or even a conversation. In this life, Mark was 100% business with no side distractors. Not afraid to pilot anything, anywhere, anytime. It was the second life, though, which would be cut short for him as he was assassinated. He was assassinated? Yeah, he was assassinated. Wow, maybe it was his character. He was shot by what was known as a long-range custom photon rifle. A photon rifle? What's that? As he was leaving to his space fighter, the dock crews had just refueled. He was 2 feet short of his fighter. One shot dropped him in a tangled mess of a body. The next 3 lives, Mark would be on the planet Tiamat, otherwise known as Malodek, which used to be right past the orbit of the planet Mars. This would be, of those 2 lives, he would be a snake humanoid, standing at 6 feet 3 inches tall. His laser green eyes missed nothing. He would, as a career, be that of a mechanic for the many different variations of business. In the corner of his home, he had built an office with a side room which he would use for a hobby, as a hobby, a snake, as a hobby, or as a snake humanoid. He had this unique hobby of hybriding fruit trees to find one which could be grown and harvested indoors without ever having to be out in natural nature. Very interesting connections in these different lives of character and things he worked on. The next life, Mark would be a tall gray on Tiamat, standing 9 feet 9 inches tall. This was a grisly life for Mark, though. As a mechanical scientist and micromechanic of systems he designed, his devices he made had, though, a high market value, though mostly attracted, unfortunately, the larger percentages of shifty businesses and those of snipers. Snipers. This was not his intentions, however, when he started making all these things. Though where the credits are the best is where his career would be the most profitable. It was not unusual for him to have a broken window on the upper levels of his office from angry citizens voicing their opinions about his building these different devices. The next 2 lives. Now, these next 2 lives, Mark would go to the Pleiadian systems of planets and moons. Here, very uniquely, listen closely, as an androidic humanoid, standing on a firm 9 foot tall with the crew-cut black hair. His 2 braids of braided hair in the very center of the back of his head, which normally those 2 braids normally rested on the mid-shoulder in length. This was a constant reminder of him, of his 2 children, his wife and him had, who were harshly removed from their life in a flash nanosecond of sniper laser bullet, which killed the 2 children instantly. For that life, which Mark had then, was of law enforcement, and it had very long, bizarre, strange hours and situations which never affected Mark and his wife, his Pleiadian wife. In fact, it was actually part of the glue that stuck the fabric of their long relationship together. Now, Mark had been off-world to go after a group of beings, the leaders of these groups, who had sniped off an upcoming council member who was entering his first term as a council member. How strange. wasn't even a council member, and he was already sniped off. Very strange cup of soup this was, Mark thought, as he was heading for that prepaid shuttle flight, return trip also paid for. And as he got onto the shuttle for his flight to his destination and sat down, the files he was looking at the projected vice screen, which was projected from the device wrapped around his left wrist. This projection widened out in front of him as he was sitting in his seat in the shuttle to 30 inches by 30-inch screen, which also had touch sensor technology, so he could do all he needed on any screen using that technology without ever needing to go back to his office. Though this particular technology he used was quite a bit outdated, it still worked seamlessly for his needs. 4 days later, it was 4 days later, he would come back on that same shuttle towards his home planet with 3 of those beings he caught at the location he had went to, who were in the cargo area, tied up, fastened to the walls. Each of those criminals around their necks were voice and sound repressors, so they could not communicate in any verbal manner with each other, and each one had a big welding helmet on each head, so they couldn't see anything either, and they couldn't hear anything. It was halfway because, well, let me go on. These leaders were so dangerous. These leaders were so wicked, so evil. This rather way of restraining them was rather necessary. But it was halfway back to the home planet. Mark heard the devastating news of his children having been sniped off as they had sat on the shoreline of a lake with their girlfriends having lunch. Though the children technically were not young anymore, as they had already celebrated their 136th birthdays rather recently, nevertheless, this rippled through Mark as he had been walking back from checking on those criminals in the cargo bay. It was like a tsunami rippling through his body over and over again. His powerful legs buckled, collapsing he did to the metal deck of that shuttle. Waves and waves of pain overtook his body. Though here, let me put in a little extra information, that this here was strange, here being in ancient times. For remember that at this time and that life, he was an androidic humanoid of the Pleiadian areas. The pains he felt rippling through his body was that a humanoid and variations of such would be able to have in their lives occurring to them. But here as an android Pleiadian humanoid, had the Pleiadians, had they in such a long time, even into the ancient times, already had mastered a full androidic humanoid that could process 100% emotions as a physical humanoid could? It was here, at that moment, Mark, as he got off that deck of that shuttle, eyes, as he looked up when he was straightening his posture, his eyes teeming in waves and waves of tears. He was an androidic humanoid, though, remember. In a rage, he stumbled back to the cargo area and opened the cargo bay doors to space, closing the door in the hallway of the shuttle. He returned, mid-tears, the cries, the cries coming down his face. Then the call from his wife, who went first through the pilot area, and then they sent it back to Mark, to the communicator on his left armrest of his seat. His wife, her beautiful face showing in that projected little screen, amid colors running around from the tears flowing down her face. "Those crazy fools shot our children. Have you made your connections yet? They shot our children." Mark cleared his voice as he was thinking on replying, and then he did. "All those leaders of that group have been extinguished." "Oh, my dear wife, how could they have killed our children?" Mark's wife, crying by now, was starting to subside. She replied, "They were cowardly animal monsters hiding in human shapes." Mark replied then, could you now say the leaders are free-range roamers?" He straightened his voice and readjusted his voice, and he repeated himself. "Well, you could say now, my dear, the leaders are free-range roamers in a very wide sense of the explanation." Mark started to crack a smile now. That will send a message to any member of any illegal group to get the heck out of this area of the living universe, unless they desire to have that same option given to them. Now, Mark was 2,610 years old. Wow, 2,610 years old when he passed on from that life. His wife had passed on after only 2,100 years old. He had never had a relationship with anyone else in all those remaining years. All of those remaining years, which were many. Though you could see him from time to time on a local natural plateau of the local mountains, some evenings playing a musical instrument to the melodies of nature around him. From that location, Mark's next 9 lives would be that in the Lyra system of planets. 3 as a snake humanoid, standing at 8 foot 11 inches tall as a farmer in the private sector. How interesting and unique. The next 3 lives, he would be a reptilian humanoid, standing at 8 feet 3 inches tall, showing a very advanced understanding of business long before that formal education for children would come to terms. Mentoring, though he didn't need it, with a local business owner of a transportation company who was a friend of his parents. This would flow into the other 2 lives, as Mark would keep within the transport business. The last 6 lives in the Lyra system of planets and moons, Mark would be an androidic humanoid, although here he would be much more androidic than humanoid. Though the long lives he worked and did business as a business engineer with the side of engineering better transport shuttle cargo restraints. Is this another situation of the living universe having a sense of humor? Which would have, these restraints would have an interactive membrane within them of intelligence to adjust the cargo tension very precisely every nanosecond to hold them together in almost any situation. But it was those last 6 lives of Mark as an androidic humanoid which showed not one single emotion. Was this a time of Mark's spirit still being in sorrow from losing the children in lives before, For sometimes the waves of time in different systems, a person's time of healing may take many years, even lifetimes. Though in many other lives showed a spirit being, before these lives of Mark, the spirit being that was very driven by his emotions to the point of perfection. Well, that is, as perfections per se were understood. But in those last 6 lives as an androidic humanoid, he would share not one emotion, though his effectiveness was without saying. This here is the ancient spirit Tralaka. As always, my friends, understand you are much more than you ever have realized. You have the potentiality. You each have a very unique story of your time stream, which is yours, which is not somebody. It is yours. It is also, it can be used to aid you in re-educating of the larger picture of life. This here is the ancient spirit Tralaka. Good night.